mostly for Indians, right? So you want to own a home because there's an emotion attached to it. Most people buy a house because they say that I don't want to pay someone else's mortgage, and I don't agree with this. Because you have been making your mortgage payments and now you have a mortgage-free house, at least in 25 years, you can sell the house and retire in a developing country like India. Whereas if you own your home mortgage-free, your cost of ownership and the cost of shelter will be a lot lower on a monthly basis. Purely mathematically speaking, renting is better than buying. Now I'm 37 and I don't intend to work after 60. Let's assume that we work for the next 30 years till I'm 67. Reason why you should actually buy a home is renting forever is better than not buying a home at all. And I'm going to prove that with numbers today. If you are new to this channel, my name is Avjot and I'm on a mission to retire 1 million immigrants with $5 million. If you watch this video and like it, it would really mean a lot if you can share this with your friends. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because I make amazing financial literacy content on this channel. Coming back to today's topic, renting is better than buying. And for that, I'm not just gonna talk here. I'm actually gonna take you to my laptop and we'll go through a calculator that I made this week, especially for you. And you can download that from the link in the description. Now let's go to my laptop and let me explain how this renting versus buying calculator actually works. So that's the calculator. There are a lot of numbers. Don't get overwhelmed by this. I'll explain one by one. It's very simple. Anything which is in blue are the editable things. So you can actually edit all these things and I'll explain that one by one. Anything which is not blue, you cannot edit. Now I can edit it, but this, particular Excel has so many formulas that if you change something, it'll just, go wonky. Now, if you are someone who is in love with Excels and formulas, I'll actually leave the password for this particular Excel when you download in the description. You can actually unlock it and you can change the numbers. But just for simplicity, for most people who are not number savvy, I've just, locked the Excel file here. All right. So what you need to do is when we are doing the calculation between renting versus buying, first of all, we need to list down what our monthly rent is and what are we comparing against. So I'll take my example. So the home that I'm living in, I actually sold the home very recently. I'll talk about that, in the coming weeks as well. And that home, actually I sold for $825,000. But if I were to rent this home, like if I was a tenant, I would pay about $3,000 in rent for the home. So I have taken $3,000 of monthly rent here. So that's the rent that I'm taking. You can actually change that, to suit yourself as well. Also make sure that, you're taking a slightly bigger home, because if you're renting forever, you need to make sure that you are renting a home that is fit for your family. Your parents are coming, you have additional bedrooms, your family is expanding, you have bedrooms for the kids. So, make sure that you are not just taking a, one bedroom condo, 1+1 condo that you're still living in. Make sure that you're taking, because we are doing numbers, like forever numbers, and we are renting, for long term, it would be good to at least take a townhouse, as an example here. But yeah, it's up to you. Anyways, so I'm taking $3,000 here. Now, your monthly stock investing budget. Now, I always say that stock investing is a habit, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But let's assume that you're not investing anything into stocks right now, and I'll talk about, when the time is right. Where are you buying? So you can just choose from, this particular drop-down menu. The reason why we choose this is because the closing cost on a home when you're buying a home is different, because in Alberta, you don't have any land transfer tax. So make sure that you're choosing, wherever you are buying a home, if you're buying a home. And then the home purchase price, let's say, I'm buying my own home, which is $825,000. So you actually buy the home that you were gonna rent for $3,000. So let's say you buy it for $825,000. What I've assumed here is the down payment is about $82,500. I've also assumed that there's no rent coming from the basement, because again, this is Ontario. $800,000 won't fetch you a home that can actually, rent out. The basement can be rented out. So there's no house hacking opportunity here. The down payment I've taken is $82,500, which is 10%. Now you can change that by unlocking the sheet. But in general, most of my clients, because they are first time home buyers, they are doing 10% down payment. So I've taken that as well. Plus closing cost of $16,500, which I've taken at 2%. For Alberta, it'll be like $1,500, $2,000. But in Ontario, most of the time it's 1.5 to 2%. I've done conservative estimates here. So the overall upfront cost that's there is $99,000. The total loan that you take, including the mortgage insurance, because we are not doing a 20% down, will be $765,000. This is deducting the down payment from the original purchase price plus the mortgage insurance that you add. The long-term interest rate, what I've taken is 4%. Now, right now, the interest rates are between 4.8 to 5.2% depending on your file. It can be a little bit, up and down. However, I have taken 4% because we are doing the calculation for 25, 30. In fact, I'll show you, we are doing the calculations for 50 years. And long-term interest rates in Canada for the last 25 years have been 4% on average. This includes the highs of like 12, 13% and the lows of 1, 2% and what's there right now, which is 4 to 5%. So I've taken 4% as a long-term interest rates for the calculation. You can again change that to your liking, but 4% I think is a decent number to take. I've taken the amortization, which is the length of the entire loan, to about 25 years. So that's another thing, that's a normal mortgage, when you do a 10% down. So I've taken that at 25 years and the mortgage payment comes out to 4041. There is a principal component to the mortgage payment and an interest component. So I've taken 1414. So let me just zoom this a little bit so that it's more visible. So I've taken 35% of the payment is actually going towards principal and 65% goes towards interest. Now I've done a very blanket calculation here. It's not as blanket. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. It depends on the tenure as well. But let's assume that it's 65% goes towards interest. Property taxes, let's say $300. That's the property tax that I pay. Insurance is about $125. Condo fee, there's no condo fee in this house. So you have to add this. Again, this is in blue, so you will be able to edit this. And then monthly maintenance, I've taken at $150. Now the way I have taken this monthly maintenance is, I always feel that there's it's a well-known rule. It's called the $1 rule, like the $1 rule, which means that you have to take maintenance, which means the faucets break, the plumbing costs, something or the other, keeps on breaking in a house, right? The dishwasher is going bad. You have to call the electrician, whatever, right? So that's $1 per square feet per year. So my home is about 1,800 square feet. 1,800 square feet equates to $1 per square feet, which is $1,800 per year divided by 12. So that's $150 per month. So that's the maintenance amount that I have taken for my home. Obviously, there are utilities as well, but I have not included utilities because even if you are renting, you will be paying utilities and it will almost be the same because it's the same house. Therefore, I'm not taking utilities for now, but I've taken all other expenses here. Total monthly expenses is 4,616. There's no rent coming from the basement. So obviously, there's no deduction here and the net expenses will remain the same, $4,600. Monthly deficit surplus, what this means is that you were paying $3,000 rent, vis-a-vis that now you are paying your net expenses to about 4,616. So the subtraction of this is about $1,600. So you're actually paying $1,600 more every single month to own a home versus what you would do when you were renting it. However, of this mortgage payment that you have, $4,000, because that's the biggest expense of this 4,600, principal is 1,400. That's actually your saving. That's actually something that is just being taken from one pocket to another. It's not an expense. Therefore, I deduct that from here. So you just add or deduct monthly principal payments, which is $1,400, and then you get a net monthly deficit of about $200. Now, if you look at these numbers, it's just a no-brainer to buy, right? Because the deficit is just $200 if you include the principal payments. And that's the reason why you see all over the internet that, people say that renting is, paying someone else's mortgage and it's not good. And, you will pay the same thing in mortgage. I don't agree to this. And I'll prove you with numbers in a bit on, I've gone all, Einstein on this one. So I'll prove you with numbers here. And you can actually download this Excel as well. Now, let's say you are not going to buy this particular home and you are going to rent, and the $100,000 that you saved up for down payment, you actually invest that into the stock market. And the stock market returns, let's say, 10%. Apart from that, we also saw that the overall deficit, without including the principal payments, the overall deficit was about $1,600. You also invest this difference every single month into the stock market. And let's assume that that also grows by 10% every single year. Now, because you have not bought a house, your mortgage payment doesn't stay the same. Your monthly expenses don't stay the same. The rent actually increases by 2.5 to 3%. And if you upgrade the home, it might increase by 7 to 8% as well. That's the year-on-year increase, this year in Ontario, and Alberta is even high. But let's assume that the rent increases by 3%, which is the normal inflation number. And every year you pay 3% more in rent. So I've just taken, like 36,000, 37, 80. So I've just taken that. And also the initial investment of $99,000, the down payment that you were going to put towards the house, you're actually now investing it into the stock market. And that also grows by, like 10% every single year. So I've just taken that. And then the yearly investment is basically the monthly investment of $1,600 deficit the next month plus the next month, and every single year that grows by 10% as well. And that's the yearly investments that you will be making. And this monthly deficit investment that you are making is also growing every single year. Now, if you do the net worth calculation, and I'm not going to get into the buying numbers, just look at this particular, sheet here, this one, rent forever. The monthly rent in year one is $3,000 because that's the rent that you will pay for this particular house. The stock portfolio at the end of year one, because you invested almost $100,000 upfront and then you invested the deficit as well, will be about $118,000. And this will grow every single year. So by the end of 5 years, your rent will increase by $300, $400, not a big deal. And your stock portfolio is now $250,000. And then year 25, let's say for 25 years that you were gonna rent it out, your rent will now increase to about $6,000 or $6,100, but your stock portfolio is also over $2 million, which is amazing. Now, I'm 37 and I don't intend to work after 60. Let's assume that we work for the next 30 years till I'm 67. So I've taken this year 30 and I have highlighted this in bold. And the reason why I've done that is because I'm assuming that this is when my income, my active income actually stops. At 67, I stop working. I don't get a salary anymore, but I still have a rent of $7,000. But I also have a stock portfolio of 3.5 million. Now, again, I've taken a pretty high number of 10% year-on-year return. You might be able to get higher. You might be able to get lower. A lot of experts feel that in the last, 30, 35 years, the stock market has returned 10%, but in the next 20 to 30 years, the stock market will not return more than 8%. Now, no one knows what's going to happen, but if you were to assume 10%, which is what has happened in the last 30 years, that's the portfolio that you will have once you stop working. So at this point, at the end of 30 years, you will be $7,000 in rent and about $3.5 million in investments. Now let's compare these renting numbers with buying numbers, and like we discussed earlier, your house ownership, which includes property taxes and all the expenses plus the mortgage payment, is $4,600, and your home equity to start with in this particular home with your down payment, and that's about it, is $78,000. And every year what I've done is I've taken a 3% inflation on the expenses other than the mortgage payment. I've assumed that the mortgage payment remains the same. You don't upgrade, you don't do much about it. Now that's not the reality, but let's assume you're not upgrading, and your property taxes and all other expenses are increasing by 3%, which is the inflation number that I've taken. And therefore, by the end of year 5, you still are paying a little bit more on your mortgage payment. It's still higher than the monthly rent, but only between year 15 and 20 is when you will be paying more rent than your mortgage. Now, assuming you keep this mortgage for 25 years and you pay off every single dime on it, and you have all equity in it and 0% interest and 0% loan on it, that's when your home will be worth $2.1 million. And the year-on-year return that I've taken on home ownership is about 4%. Now, in the last 25 years, on average, the home prices in Canada has increased by 7% year-on-year. If you take the last 50 years, it's about 4.8%. I've taken even lower at 4%, and let's, for argument's sake, you can actually change this to 3% as well. But let's assume it's 4%, which is very conservative, I would say, and the home value, the same $825,000 home, is now worth $2.1 million. Now, it's impossible, to even believe that, this will be $2.1 million, but also know that this particular home would have costed like 20 years ago for about $190,000, $180,000. So if the home prices have increased by 6-7 times in the last, 20 years, who is to say that, they'll not increase by double or 2.5x in the next 25 years. So I think 4% number is pretty fair. So at the end of 25 years, you are worth $2.1 million, and because you do not have a stock portfolio, all your equity is actually logged into a roof that you'll always need. And therefore, mathematically speaking, and purely mathematically speaking, renting is better than buying, because even though you are paying $7,000, $6,000 of rent after year 25, you still have more money which is not locked into an asset, and you can live off the dividends that you get from that 2.1 million portfolio, which is not possible if everything is locked into your primary home. Now, like I said before, after year 30, you stop working, but between year 25 and 30, there was a differential, and now you're actually winning as a homeowner because there's rent being paid, which is upwards of $6,000 to $7,000, but your payments are just $1,000 to $1,300 on the home ownership side because there's no mortgage. You actually invest that difference for the next 5 years, and you end up with a portfolio of just under $4 $400,000, again assuming that there is 10% year-on-year increase. And at the end of 30 years, you are actually far worse in terms of net worth as a homeowner at just under $3 million versus if you were investing everything into the stock market and still renting, you would be at $3.5 million. However, the difference is this. The monthly cost of ownership at this point is $1,300. So your cost of shelter is just $1,300 versus in year 30 when you stop working, your cost of rent is $7,000 a month and increasing every single year. Now in 30 years, I'm still 67 and I'm hoping that I'll live for another 10 to 20 years. And that's where I actually extrapolate these numbers to even, year 50 when I'm 87. And the problem is between year 30 to year 50, that just looks like two lines, but it's not two lines. It's 20 years in between and the rents are increasing and you would be paying almost $2.4 million in rent if we continue to rent. Whereas if you own your home mortgage free, your cost of ownership and the cost of shelter will be a lot lower on a monthly basis, especially when you don't have any active income. However, that's where the law of compounding comes into play. And you would see that if you look at these calculations for year 40, your net worth is about $9 million, again assuming 10% increase year on year in the stock market. And you are at about almost half, $4.8 million of net worth, which is again, a lot of it is locked into your home equity. Now, year 30 onwards, you're actually not putting any new money into the stock market. It's just growing 10%. Whatever the principal we had, we did not take anything out and it just grows, 10% every single year. So I've not included any new money that we put into the stock market. It's just year on year growth. And in year 50, you would end up with about $8 million if you are a homeowner. And again, more than half of it is locked into your home, which you always need to live in. On the other hand, your stock portfolio will be about $23 million. However, your rent will also be about $12,000 a month. Now, the problem is that you cannot sustain this particular growth purely because you would need to pull some money out of your savings or your investments in order to meet your high monthly obligations of rent. And remember, in 30 years after the age of 67, I'm not working and I'm purely living off my investments, which at that point is about $3.4 million. And I still have to pay $2.3 million in rent over the next 2 years. I know it's very complicated and these numbers can actually change wildly if I change a few things here. Let's say this 10% growth that I'm assuming, this actually is not 10% and it's 8%. Suddenly you will see that then it's not very different. And then probably buying makes more sense. So obviously I'm assuming that there's a 10% year-on-year return in the stock market. If you are able to achieve that or more, definitely renting would make a lot more sense. If you are not planning to, retire in Canada, it would definitely make sense. The other thing that you need to also, think of is the tax implications, because the stock portfolio, you cannot put everything into TFSA, which is a tax sheltered account. You have to put into a non-registered account as well. And therefore you have tax liability on the stock portfolio when you sell those stocks. However, if your money is logged into home equity and you sell your primary home, you actually do not pay any capital gain taxes. So this money is actually tax free. So there's so many things that you need to consider, but purely mathematically speaking, and if the stock market grows by 10% vis-a-vis 4% for the real estate, you would be ahead. You would come out ahead in the stock portfolio. The other thing that we need to note is that half of all this money, all these gains, all this portfolio is actually assuming that you invested the $100,000 or the down payment that you were saving for the house into the stock market. If you don't do that, and if you don't have the discipline to invest every single month, the differential between your mortgage related expenses and the rent, you would actually not end up at this number. It will be a lot lower than this, and then probably it makes sense to buy because it's forced saving. Because you have been making your mortgage payments and now you have a mortgage free house, at least in 25 years, you can sell the house and retire in a developing country like India. Now, I personally do not like either or. I'm an and person here, because the problem with the first scenario where you rent forever is that yes, you have a big stock portfolio at the end of 30 years and it grows and compounds till, at 87 at about $23 million, assuming a 10% return. But the problem is that if I'm, and I want to retire in Canada, I just don't want to be in a position where I have to shell out $12,000 a month at the age of 80 only in rent payments, especially when I am not earning any active income. That's my problem with the first scenario. However, if I do only the second scenario and I actually do not invest a lot into the stock market and I just make, my mortgage payments, even that's not good, because when I stop working, I have very little left in my liquid stock portfolio and I cannot live off that money because it's hardly anything. $392,000 will mean nothing in 30 years. And all my net worth is actually trapped into my home equity. And the only way I can live for the next 20 years is if I downsize or move to another country country which is more developing, and this dollar amount can be stretched a long way in a developing country. And that's what gets me to my hybrid approach, where I actually do both. I want to put my eggs into two different baskets, because if the stock market does not return 10% for the next 30 years, I still have some net worth into my primary home, and worst case, I can actually sell everything, pay the taxes on only the stock component of it, and just take everything tax-free on my primary accommodation and go to India and retire well. That's where, if you remember in the beginning of the presentation, I had this particular row which says your monthly stock investing budget, and that budget for me is $2,500. Let's assume it's $2,000 for you. If I invest $2,000 every single month as a habit, that $2,000 for the first 12 months, let's say in your first year, is $24,000. That compounds again at 10%. If you are taking 10% at $146,000, $382,000, all the way to about $4 million of portfolio that I'll have along with my primary accommodation at the end of 30 years when I'm retiring. This way, I have a 2.5 million completely paid off house at the end of 30 years when I'm retiring, and I also have $4 million of stock portfolio. If the stock portfolio does not return 10%, I still have about $2.7 million of stock portfolio. And therefore, I always tell people that you should buy your primary home. However, you should buy what you can afford without compromising your budget for the stock market, because that's your safety net and that's the liquidity that you'll need when you retire, because you'll always need your primary home over your head. I know this is a lot to take in. This Excel is there in the description. Just download that, play around with it, play around with your numbers. I will play around with one more number actually, just for fun, right? So let's say you were buying an $825,000 house in Calgary, and you're actually moving to Calgary, and the basement gives you a $1,500 rent. The numbers will be completely different then, because now the cost of ownership is much lower. You would see that, your stock portfolio is not that impressive, because the difference between your monthly rent in Ontario and your overall cost of ownership, because now you're getting $1,500 in rent from the basement, is a lot lower, and you would see that you would be way better off in terms of your net worth at the end of 30 years when you're retiring, and a stock portfolio is not that impressive. And therefore, house hacking definitely is a case where you would absolutely want to buy and not rent, because you will be way ahead on net worth in 30 years when you retire. Now, every situation is different, and if you want to know what your situation is, if you want to understand and assess if you are ready to buy a home, if these numbers make sense for you or not, I would highly suggest that you just book a call from this particular link, or you can go to the website growwithnav.com and book a call from there. Now, I know this Excel is crazy and it's not for the light-hearted for sure. However, let me just summarize the entire thing. Now, most people buy a house because they say that I don't want to pay someone else's mortgage, and I don't agree with this. The reason why you should actually buy a home is four or five reasons I'll talk about. The first reason is lack of stability in a rental, especially if you need to be in a school district for your kids. Because in a rental, the problem is if the landlord actually decides to sell their home, you can actually be thrown out of the house. Now in Ontario, you are very much protected as a tenant, but still there's no stability. You might have to change your neighborhood and therefore the school for your kid as well, because that's how it works in Canada. And that's a lack of stability that you would not want, especially with kids, and that's the reason to buy. The second reason is, and we discussed that in our Excel as well, mortgage and rent-free retirement. Because in 25 to 30 years, you may not be making a lot of active income. And if you're retiring in Canada, there's no point of paying $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $12,000 in rent every single month, because believe it or not, these rents will continue to increase going forward. And the third one is more emotional, and that's mostly for Indians, right? So you want to own a home because there's an emotion attached to it. I really want to make memories with my family, and that's a really good reason to purchase a home. And fourth, and this is something that I also talked about, is portfolio diversification is so important. If the stock market doesn't return 10%, 12%, 13% that we are hoping for, we have something to fall back upon, and that's your primary home. And there's 0% capital gain tax on your primary home when you sell it, and that would mean that you can actually pull out all the money for your retirement and live in a retirement home, or you move to India, and those capital gains from your primary home can actually stretch a long way in a developing country. I hope you liked this video. I hope you did not get confused looking at this video. I know it was a lot of numbers, but if you liked the video, do hit the like button, share it with a friend, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel. मिलते हैं अगली वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए बाय बाय।